Hello everyone, my name is Anastasia Oliver, and the theory that I have chosen is client-centered theory. The founder of client-centered theory was Mr. Carl Rogers. Carl was a major spokesperson for humanistic psychology. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois. He was the fourth of 6 children. He had a very close, religious, and strict family. Play was discouraged. I thought this was really strange because I know how important play is for a child. It's important for their development and for them to engage and interact in the world around them. He also was very lonely as a child. He focused more on scholarly interests rather than social ones. He was a very introverted person. He spent a lot of time reading and engaging in imaginative activities. He also held many academic positions. Some of these positions included education, social work, counseling, psychotherapy, group therapy, peace, and interpersonal relationships. He also has been named Father of Psychotherapy Research. I also put a quote there underneath his picture. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. I just really like that. And so there he is. That's Carl Rogers for you. I've also added Natalie Rogers. She's a pioneer in this field. She used expressive arts for personal growth. She did this by what became known as person-centered expressive arts therapy. This was done by a variety of forms: movement, painting, sculpting, music, and writing, just to name a few. The goal was to develop this creative connection in order to access the inner feelings. You do this through the sequence of movement, sound, visual art, journal writing. The end goal was to discover hidden and unconscious thoughts that were discovered, and these insights are shared with the therapist. Okay, so there was actually 4 periods of development. It hasn't always been called client-centered therapy. It started as non-directive counseling in the 40s, and then it went to person-centered approach that is mainly used today and referred to today. That occurred in the 80s and 90s. So I'm going to start with non-directive counseling and work my way forward. That way you can see where it started and where it has ended up today. So non-directive counseling, 1940s. He was actually at Ohio State University at the time. He published a book called Counseling and Psychotherapy, Newer Concepts and Practice. So what exactly is a non-directive counseling? So this is usually when it emphasizes the counselor's creation of a permissive and non-directive climate. You would normally see non-directive counselors avoid sharing a great deal about themselves with their clients. They instead focus mainly on reflecting and clarifying the verbal and nonverbal, whichever, communication that was being expressed from their client. Then the therapist's main goal was to try to gain insight into the feelings expressed by their clients. Okay, so that moves it to the second stage of client-centered therapy, and this was in the 1950s. So this was how he renamed his approach during this time. It emphasized more on the client rather than on the non-directive methods. He also started a counseling center at the University of Chicago at that time. So this period looked more for how the client views the world rather than focusing on their feelings. So he assumed the best vantage point for understanding how people behave was from their own internal frame of reference, and that is actually on page 166 quoted. So this was a huge shift, and this is the whole reason why he renamed the approach in the 1950s. Okay, and that brings us into the late 50s and 70s, and I refer to this as the student-centered teaching approach. So this was actually a pretty long period with a lot of research. He had a hypothesis that he was testing that resulted in 3 decades of research. So the main thing that he wanted to emphasize and understand was what exactly was the role of the therapist. A significant publication at this time for him was called On Becoming a Person. So kind of like what the name implies, it means that he described what does it mean to become the self that one truly is. He actually wrote this at the time while he was in Wisconsin. Um, he attended the university there. In this book, he described the process of becoming one's experience. So then another main turning point was during the 1950s and in the 1960s. Like I said, they're just mainly testing the hypothesis of the client-centered approach. So they're just conducting extensive research on just trying to understand the process and the outcomes of psychotherapy. The main question that was being addressed is how people best progress in psychotherapy. So in the end, research findings consistently supported his approach. They confirmed that the therapeutic change is due to personal and interpersonal factors, so rather than using specific techniques. And that's the overall idea of the client-centered therapy. So how exactly did it become the student-centered teaching? Well, because at the end, the approach was just refined and expanded. And so one of the things that it was applied to was education. And so this third period was called student-centered teaching. This approach was also applied to encounter groups. And then that brings us to the fourth phase, person-centered approach that occurred in the 80s and then the 90s. So this was just marked by a huge expansion to education, couples and families, industry, groups, etc. And then that's when this theory had changed and shifted and became the person-centered approach. The shift in terms just mainly reflects the broadening application of the approach. Okay, and then this is the 4 periods of development continued. I touched on some of this stuff on the last slide, but this is just, in my opinion, tying it all together, explaining the 4 different stages of counseling for this theory. So, like I said, it started in non-directive counseling in the 40s. As I put on here, this is whenever the therapist is permissive, has a non-directive climate, and then the main thing they need to do is listen, support, and advise the client on what the best actions are to take for whatever circumstances is going on. This was more of a focus on the feelings of the clients. That was one main big difference between non-directive and client-centered therapy. Client-centered therapy focuses more on the client. They shifted to the focus on how the client views the world. That is the main difference there from where it began to where it ended up. And then, like I said, on the student-centered teaching one, this was mainly a research period. It confirmed the client-centered therapy and how this works. And so they applied it to education and encounter groups. And then lastly, that brings us to person-centered approach. And this is just mainly just applying this theory to different groups of education, couples and families, groups, politics, and so then that's how it got that name, just because of the approach and transpiring from where it began to where it is now. That brings us to exactly what is client-centered theory. So this is when a therapist uses a non-directive role and engages in active listening. So this is a non-directive form of talk therapy, meaning it allows the client to lead the conversation and does not attempt to steer the client in any way. The therapist places much of the responsibility on the client. The goal is to help the client become a fully functioning person. So, how does someone become a fully functioning person? Rogers believed that a fully functioning person is someone who is continually working toward becoming self-actualized. So that brings us to one of the key terms, self-actualization. So this is when people have an actualizing tendency or need to achieve their full potential. So the therapist enters the client's role and lets them take charge, and the reason that this theory believes that they should be the one to take charge, pretty much, and therapist is more of a guider, is because they feel like the client knows best. So they believe people have the power and motivation to help themselves. Okay, and so that pretty much overall explains what client-centered theory is. And like I said, another type of term that is used is person-centered therapy. And so I saw this picture and I thought this was a really good type of way to visually see what I'm saying. The goal is congruence. So as you can see, Self-concept is on the right side, and this is what you believe about yourself. And so that's trying to get closer to what your real self is. So the therapist is trying to bring the self-concept closer to the real self. And so if you have incongruence, this can have many harmful effects. One is that it prevents self-actualization. You have to know who you are to be able to fulfill your potential, and I really like that. Emotion-focused therapy was also discussed in the book it emerged as a person-centered approach. This is informed by understanding the role of emotion in human functioning. So the biggest thing it does is it recognizes the importance of emotions, and like I said, how can we use emotions to understand how humans are and how they function. So it helps the clients increase understanding of their own emotions, and it establishes a relationship between the client and the therapist. So there's two major tasks that are trying to be achieved through this therapy. They want to help clients with too little emotions be able to find their emotions, express their emotions, get how they're feeling out there, and then also the ones that express and experience emotions too much, they want to be able to help them contain their emotions. So the guy that actually came up with this was Leslie Greenberg. And I also found one of his books online. It's called Coaching Clients to Work Through Their Feelings. I thought that was a pretty good book, it looked like. So if you want to check that out, you can. So online, I also found 3 principles that he has as a guide to working effectively with emotions. The first one is you want to increase their awareness of the emotion. And then you also want to enhance the emotion regulation, and then lastly, transform the emotion. So this type of therapy is based on attachment and bonding, and it's just trying to help the clients gain a greater awareness of their emotions, and then the therapist's job is to provide strategies for them to cope with, regulate, and transform their emotions. So when did it come about? What was going on in the world? This theory, like I said in the beginning, was developed in the 1940s. It offered an alternative to the psychoanalytic and behavioral theories of the time. That was one thing that it was pushing against. One main difference between them was it was less concerned with techniques. It was more concerned with their relationship. I've also noted that the child guidance movement used many directive techniques at this time, but they were looking for more practical methods. So from 1928 to 1940, Rogers worked as a director of the Child Study Department of the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and he also worked at the Guidance Center. This was a way that he was able to give them the practical methods that they were looking for to help children and adults with psychological, emotional, and social adjustment problems. He was able to do that because during these years he worked with thousands of troubled children and adults, and this was when he was able to start developing his own ideas on what he thought about counseling and psychotherapy. So the difference was it did a big shift from an emphasis on the past content and techniques to now he was more focusing on the self-insight and self-acceptance with the therapeutic relationship. Okay, so what need did it fill? Why was it created? Differ, expanded on from other theories? So first, the need that it filled was it allowed the client to lead the conversation, taking charge of their own life. So through this non-directive approach to therapy, a therapist's job is just to relay back to the client what they have expressed, so that that client can identify the changes they would like to make in their life. This was pretty much a way I say as taking the reins of your life. Like that's the main thing about this theory is it's client led, and this is a way to work with people experiencing all types of different problems. And I feel like that ties it into why was it created. By giving them the reins, it empowers and motivates the client into the counseling process. And then the goal is to use this power for personal and social transformation. Okay, so how did it differ? I feel like I kind of touched on that earlier, but to kind of reiterate, it made counseling more personal. During this time, the forms of therapy available were behavioral or psychodynamic, and so these techniques or these therapies use techniques to try to get the client to do something. The client-centered therapy doesn't really use techniques, and they also didn't believe the goal of therapy was to solve problems. So the biggest thing that they looked on is what was on the surface, and the other approaches during that time focused more on the subconscious or unconscious experience of clients. Okay, and then that brings me to expanded on other theories. I actually ended up finding two other ones in the book that were mentioned as something that they pushed against. So the first one listed was very similar and honestly kind of tends to be confusing for most students because they share a lot in common. They share respect for the client's subjective experience, how they see the world, and they trust in the client to make positive and conscious choices. That's pretty much kind of relating what I was talking about earlier, giving them the reins, realizing that they have the power, the freedom, the choice, and purpose, and finding that meaning to find where they need to go in life. And then lastly, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Got that on there. I'm sure you guys have seen that before. Getting the basic needs met before you can become actual self-actualized. So that was in the book also. So the biggest thing that Maslow had to offer was he was a pioneer in the development of humanistic psychology, and he was influential in furthering the understanding of self-actualizing. So the biggest thing that he did is he informed us of core characteristics of self-actualizing people, and these are self-awareness, freedom, basic honesty and caring, and trust and autonomy. And there's many other characteristics that are listed on page 169 if you want to look at those. So the biggest thing is this ties in and is compatible with the person-centered philosophy. Okay, so reflecting back, thinking from the very beginning of that chart that I had on congruence, so why do people hurt? That is a great way to look at it. He believed that people have one basic motive, going back to self-actualizing. And to get that, to achieve that, you must be in a state of congruence to reach that. So like we had on that chart, you have to be equal in what you want to be and what your behavior is actually doing. So who the person wants to be needs to be equal to their behavior. If there's any conflict of what they value in themselves and what others value in them, there will be a problem. That is what causes hurt, in his opinion, that I have found. Okay, so what promotes change? What causes differences? I found several different things that are a little bit different from each other, but I kind of tied it up and just thought that this is what Rogers really thought was the goal in life for people to be changed. Going back to the fully functioning person, we've explained that in depth, and achieving that goal. So that will eliminate or decrease feelings of distress and any negative emotions that are going on. Increases self-esteem, openness to experience. They become more self-aware on what they're able to do, who they are, and they're able to establish strong connections with their therapist. And this is whenever the relationship part comes into it. I've read several times where it said that they don't feel like the client will change and will actually end up becoming different without first establishing that trust and that connection. You have to have that first, because that way the therapist can guide the client on the things that they want to get out of life and the things and the goals that they have. Okay, key concepts and words. These are the ones that I found throughout the chapter that I thought were most important and that were bolded. And so if you, I just briefly have a description next to these words, but you can read more in depth throughout the chapter. The first one is actualizing tendency, the drive all people have to strive to their potential. This is a directional process of striving towards realization, fulfillment, autonomy, and self-determination. And this is on page 170. Okay, and then the next one is the therapeutic core conditions. This is something that is also very important that I have not mentioned, is there's 3 core conditions that he believes that this is what was needed for therapeutic change to occur. It did not matter according to the client type. It was always necessary and sufficient for these 3 conditions to happen. The therapist needs to have empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. Now, I do have those 3 listed under the therapeutic core conditions, and this is all on page 173 of the book. So the unconditional positive regard is just mainly having acceptance and caring towards your client. This is mainly just not judging how the client's feelings, the thoughts, and behavior as good or bad. They value their client, they accept their clients, and it's just mainly overall not being judgmental towards them. Next one is congruence, and this implies that therapists are real. So I'm sure you may be wondering, what does it mean to be real? To me, this is without a false front. So that means their inner experience is matching their outer expression of that experience. So when they're presenting themselves with a relationship with a client, it's all matching up. It's not 2 different people. And lastly, empathy is the last one. This is mainly the ability to understand and share feelings of another person. This is when the therapist has a deep and subjective understanding of their client with the client. It is not sympathy or feeling sorry for the client. And I also listed 3 different words below empathy, and that's because I found also on page 175, Clark had a model of empathy in the counseling process, and it was based on 3 ways of knowing, and these 3 ways were subjective, and then interpersonal and objective. And so subjective empathy enables them to experience what it is like to be the client, putting themselves in their shoes. And then the interpersonal empathy is understanding their client's internal frame of reference and trying to convey a sense of the private meanings to the person. And lastly, on page 175, it talks about objective empathy. And this relies on knowledgeable sources outside of a client's frame of reference. And I thought this was pretty interesting because I've never actually heard of any of that before. So you want to check that out. And then lastly, presence is paying attention and engaging in the client and their concerns. To have this, some of the skills and qualities that you need are listening, accepting, respecting, understanding, and responding. So being completely attentive to and all engaged in the client and what's going on with them. And then immediacy is addressing what is going on between the client and the therapist. It's encouraging the use of a wider variety of methods. And it allows for considerable diversity and personal style among the person-centered therapists. And then this can be found on page 177, both presence and immediacy can. Lastly, accurate empathetic understanding. This can be found on page 176. So it's sensing the client's feelings as their own and without getting lost in those feelings. So the therapist is going to sense the client's feelings, but they're not going to let them get into those feelings. So it's a way for the therapist to have the meanings expressed by their clients that often lie at the edge of their awareness. So those are the main key concepts and words that I found. And like I said, you can go deeper. It's just kind of a brief overview on those words. Okay, so let's review. Questions to ponder. So why do you think that the client feels more motivated and empowered when the therapist uses the client-centered theory? Do you see any potential problems with the client being in charge of the therapy? What do you think some of the strengths and limitations are of this approach? And that's actually in the book. And then here's some questions and answers. What are the 3 therapeutic core conditions that we just discussed, and you can find those on the slide before. It's empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. Question number 2, how was the client-centered theory different from other theories at the time? The main overall difference was it focused more on the therapeutic relationship rather than the techniques. Okay, and that brings me to my last slide for the references. So here is the websites that you can find my information at. Also, the book was one reference that I used a lot. Yep, that's it. That is the client-centered theory. Thank you for listening.